Welcome to the Curious Voyager. It's lovely to have you here tonight. Wherever you are, whatever corner of the world you've folded yourself into, whatever hour it happens to be there, I'm glad you found your way to this quiet place. Maybe you're lying in the dark with the blankets pulled up to your chin. Maybe there's a lamp still on somewhere across the room, throwing a soft yellow light against the ceiling, and you keep meaning to reach over and turn it off, and you haven't yet. Maybe there's a cup of something warm going cold on the nightstand. That's all right. You don't have to finish it. You don't have to finish anything tonight. Before we begin, let me tell you what we're going to do. And then let me tell you that you don't have to pay very close attention to any of it. Tonight we're going to drift, slowly, through the entire history of secrets. 4,000 years of them. The whole long, strange story of how human beings learned to hide what they were saying from the people who wanted to read it, and, just as important, how those other people kept finding ways to read it anyway. It's a story full of kings and codebreakers, of monks and machines, of a queen who lost her head, and a telegram that pulled a nation into war. And underneath all of it, running quietly like a thread through the whole thing, there's a single problem. One problem. A problem so stubborn that for 4,000 years the cleverest people alive simply assumed it could never be solved, not because they weren't trying, but because it looked less like a puzzle and more like a law of nature. Like gravity, like the fact that time only moves one way. And then, in the space of about 3 years in the 1970s, 3 little papers made that problem simply dissolve, vanish, as if it had never been impossible at all. We'll get there. But we'll take our time getting there, because there's no rush at all. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, if you never make it to the codebreakers, never make it to the machines, that is perfectly, completely fine. The story will still be here. It's a very old story. It has waited a long time. It can wait for you to wake up. And if you're the kind of listener who likes these slow journeys and wants more of them, a quiet like or a subscribe genuinely helps this sleepy little channel keep sailing along. Small creators like me really do rely on it, and I'm grateful to every one of you who's already come aboard. But that's the last I'll ask of you tonight, I promise. Mostly I'd just love to know, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it in your corner of the night? Leave it in a comment if you feel like it, sometime before your eyes get too heavy. I always love reading them. I'll try not to make this so interesting that it keeps you awake. Though if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something. A fair trade, I think. So, let's begin, shall we? Slowly, gently, one secret at a time. Let me start with a warning of a kind. Almost every secret code you're about to hear about was at some point called unbreakable. People staked their reputations on it, people staked their kingdoms on it, people staked their lives on it. And nearly every single one of them was wrong. That's the first quiet truth of this whole story, and it's worth carrying with you into the dark. The word unbreakable, in the long history of secrets, has almost always been a promise that was about to be broken. Here's one of the sharpest examples, and I'll give it to you now because it sets the stakes for everything that follows. In the year 1586, in England, there was a woman named Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a prisoner, held under guard on the orders of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, and she was, at that point, a very dangerous prisoner to keep alive. Because a great many people believed that Mary, not Elizabeth, was the rightful Queen of England. And while she was locked away, Mary began exchanging letters, secret letters, with a young man named Anthony Babington, who was part of a plot. Not a small plot. A plot to murder Queen Elizabeth, and put Mary on the throne. Now, Mary was not a fool. She knew that her letters might be intercepted. So she didn't write them in plain words. She wrote them in cipher, a secret code, a jumble of strange symbols and stand-in signs that only she and her allies were supposed to be able to read. To anyone else, it would look like nonsense, meaningless marks on a page. She trusted that code with her life, quite literally, as it turned out. What Mary didn't know was that her secret letters were already being read. Every single one of them. They were being intercepted by the agents of Elizabeth's spymaster, a cold and patient man named Francis Walsingham, and handed to a cryptanalyst, a codebreaker named Thomas Phelippes. And Phelippes was very, very good at his work. Mary's cipher, the one she was betting her life on, was to Phelippes a lock he could pick in his sleep. He read her secret letters as easily as you're hearing my voice right now. And then he did something that still, all these centuries later, gives me a small chill in the dark. Phelippes didn't just read Mary's letters. He forged one. Using her own secret cipher, the code she believed was safe, he added a few extra lines to one of her messages, in her own hand, in her own code, asking her fellow conspirators to send along their names. He wanted the whole list. He wanted every plotter drawn out into the open by a postscript the Queen herself had never written. It worked. The trap closed, and on the strength of those broken, forged and captured letters, Mary, Queen of Scots, was convicted of treason and beheaded in February of 1587. A queen. Executed, in effect, because her secret code was not as secret as she believed. Because someone was reading over her shoulder the whole time, and she never knew. Hold on to that as we drift back into the past. Because that is what's really at stake in this whole long story. Not abstractions, not mathematics, not yet. People, their lives, their nations, their most private words. From the very beginning, secret writing was never a game. It was a matter of who lived and who died. And here is the strangest part. The thing this whole journey is quietly built around. For 4,000 years, every clever mind that worked on this problem was, in a sense, working on the wrong thing. They thought the hard part was the scrambling. They thought the challenge was to take a message and twist it, tangle it, disguise it so thoroughly that no enemy could ever unpick it. And so they built better and better ways to scramble. More and more ingenious knots. And every single knot eventually came undone. Because the scrambling was never really the problem, there was a deeper problem underneath it. A problem so quiet and so constant that for most of history nobody even thought to name it, the way a fish doesn't think to name the water. And we'll come to it, slowly, tonight, but first, let's go back, way back, further than Mary, further than England, all the way to the very beginning. Let's go back to the first people who ever tried to keep a secret on purpose. Let's begin in Sparta. Picture, if you like, a soldier in ancient Greece thousands of years ago. He's far from home, out on some campaign, and he needs to send a message back to his commanders, orders, maybe, or news of the enemy. And it absolutely cannot be read if it falls into the wrong hands. A messenger carrying that message could be captured, could be searched, could be killed, and his pockets emptied. So how do you send words across a dangerous distance in a way that only the right person can understand? The Spartans had a tool for this, and it was beautifully simple. It was called a citale. Say it however you like in the dark, it hardly matters. What matters is what it was, and it was almost nothing at all. It was a rod, a wooden staff, a cylinder of a particular fixed thickness. That's the whole secret, really, the thickness of the rod. Here's how it worked. You'd take a long, thin strip of leather or parchment, and you'd wind it around the rod, spiraling it along the length of the staff, one loop snug against the next, like a bandage wrapped around a limb, or a stripe of ribbon curling down a candy cane. And then, with the strip wound tight around the wood, you'd write your message along the length of the rod, straight across the coils, line by line, the way you'd write on any flat surface, each letter sitting neatly on its little band of leather. And then you'd unwind it, and the moment you unwound that strip from the rod, the message fell apart. What had been a clean line of writing became a long ribbon of scattered letters, spaced strangely, going nowhere, meaning nothing. The letters were all still there, every single one of them, in the leather, in your hand. But they were in the wrong order. Or rather, they were in an order that only made sense when the strip was wound back around a rod of exactly the right thickness. A messenger could carry that ribbon of leather across enemy lines, and if he were caught and searched, his captors would find only a meaningless tangle of letters, a strip of gibberish they could stare at all day and never crack. Unless they happened to have a rod of precisely the same diameter to wind it back around. Then, and only then, would the letters climb back into their rows and the message rise up out of the chaos, whole again. There's a lovely word for what the citale does. We call it a transposition cipher. And it's worth sitting with that idea for a moment, gently, because it's one of the two great families that all secret writing falls into, and we'll meet them both tonight. A transposition cipher doesn't change your letters into other letters. It doesn't disguise them. It just moves them, shuffles them. It takes the right letters and puts them in the wrong order. Every letter of your message is still sitting right there in plain sight. They've simply been scrambled out of sequence, like a sentence cut apart with scissors and the pieces swept into a pile. The secret isn't in the letters, the secret is in the arrangement. And the key that restores the arrangement, the thing you absolutely must have, and the enemy absolutely must not, is the thickness of that rod. Now, I should be honest with you here, the way I'll try to be honest all through this journey, because the truth is often gentler and more interesting than the legend. We're not entirely sure the Spartans really used the citale to hide their military secrets the way the stories say they did. Most of what we know comes from an ancient writer named Plutarch, and from others writing well after the fact, and some historians who've looked closely suspect the citale may have started life as something a little more humble, not a way to conceal a message at all, but a way to prove a messenger was genuine. A kind of ancient badge of authenticity. Only the true messenger would arrive with a strip that fit your rod. But whether it was born for secrecy or grew into it, the citale is still, as far as we know, one of the very first physical tools human beings ever built for the deliberate keeping of secrets. A rod and a ribbon of leather. So simple. And already, right at the dawn of it, you can feel that one deep problem beginning to stir. The problem that will haunt this entire story. Because the whole thing only works if the person on the other end already has a rod of the very same thickness. Somehow, before any message is ever sent, both sides have to already share the secret of the rod. Keep that quietly in mind. We'll return to it. We always return to it. Let's move forward now, a few centuries, from Greece to Rome, and meet a cipher so famous that it still carries the name of the man who used it. The Caesar cipher. Julius Caesar, the story goes, and this one comes down to us from a Roman writer named Suetonius, who set it down in a book about the lives of the Caesars. Julius Caesar wanted to keep his private correspondence private. And his method was different from the Spartan rod. He didn't shuffle the order of his letters, he replaced them. Each letter of his message he swapped out for a different letter, according to one simple rule: shift each one 3 places along the alphabet. So where he meant to write an A, he'd write a D instead. Where he meant a B, he'd write an E. C became F. And so on, every letter marching 3 steps forward down the line of the alphabet, and the ones near the end looping quietly back around to the beginning. To anyone who didn't know the rule, Caesar's letters would read as pure nonsense, a wall of wrong letters. But his trusted generals, who knew to simply shift everything back 3 places, could unwrap the meaning in a moment. Now here we meet the other great family of ciphers, the second of the two. This isn't transposition, nothing's been shuffled. This is what we call a substitution cipher. Instead of moving your letters around, you swap each one for a stand-in. A becomes D, and it always becomes D. Everywhere it appears, all through the message. Every letter has a fixed disguise it wears from beginning to end. Where the transposition cipher keeps your letters and scrambles their order, the substitution cipher keeps your order and disguises your letters. 2 different tricks, 2 different families, and nearly every secret code in the 4,000 years that follow is, at heart, some clever combination of just those 2 ideas: mix up the order or swap out the symbols. That's very nearly the whole toolbox. It's a rather comforting thought, actually, as you lie there in the dark. All that ingenuity, all those centuries, and underneath, just 2 simple moves. But the Caesar cipher has a weakness, a fatal one. And it's the same weakness the citale had, wearing a slightly different coat. Think about it softly. Caesar shifted his letters by 3, but he could just as easily have shifted them by 4, or by 5, or by 10. There are only so many ways to shift the alphabet before you loop all the way around and end up back where you started. 25 ways, to be exact. 25 possible shifts. And that is a devastatingly small number, because it means that anyone who intercepts a Caesar-enciphered message, and who suspects how it was made, doesn't need to be clever at all. They just need to be patient, and not even very patient. They can simply try every possibility, shift everything back by 1, and see if it makes sense. No? Shift back by 2. Still nonsense? By 3? Ah, there it is, words rising up out of the noise. At most, 25 little attempts, and the secret falls open. We have a name for that kind of attack, and it's a wonderfully plain one. Brute force. You don't outwit the lock, you just try every key on the ring until one of them turns, and when a lock has only 25 keys, brute force isn't a struggle. It's an afternoon's idle work. A child could do it today, sitting at a kitchen table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, working through the shifts one by one until the message tumbles out. The mighty cipher of the greatest general of Rome, undone by a bored child with a pencil. That's the humbling arc of this whole story. Again and again, yesterday's unbreakable secret is tomorrow's bedtime puzzle. So the early ciphers were fragile things. The citale, undone if you could guess the thickness of a rod. The Caesar cipher, undone by trying 25 shifts. For a while, though, the simple substitution cipher seemed to offer a way out of that particular trap. Because you didn't have to shift the alphabet by a fixed amount. You could scramble it completely. Instead of A always becoming D and B always becoming E, in a neat marching line, you could make A become Q, and B become J, and C become X. A completely jumbled, random pairing, every letter matched to some other letter, with no pattern at all. And when you do that, the number of possible arrangements stops being 25. It becomes a number so vast it's genuinely hard to hold in the mind. The number of ways you can shuffle 26 letters into pairs is larger than the number of seconds that have passed since the beginning of the universe. Enormously larger. So many possibilities that no army of bored children with pencils could ever hope to try them all. Brute force is dead. The lock has too many keys to test in 100 lifetimes. And so, for a long time, people believed the scrambled substitution cipher was safe, truly safe. Unbreakable even, there's that word again. And they were wrong. Because it turns out you don't have to try all those countless keys. There's a back door. A weakness hidden not in the number of arrangements but in the language itself. And the person who found that back door lived more than 1,000 years ago in one of the great cities of the world, and his discovery was so powerful that it killed this entire family of ciphers stone dead for the next 1,000 years. Let me take you there. Let me take you to Baghdad. It's the 9th century now. We've travelled a long way from Sparta, a long way from Rome, east and forward in time, to the city of Baghdad, in what was then the heart of the Islamic world, the Abbasid Golden Age, a time and a place of extraordinary learning. Picture a house of scholars, shelves heavy with manuscripts, a culture that prized knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, language, all of it gathered and studied and argued over and written down. And in that world lived a man with a very long and very beautiful name, Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi. We'll call him al-Kindi. He was a philosopher, a polymath, one of those minds that seemed to touch everything: mathematics, music, medicine, the stars. And somewhere in all that thinking, he turned his attention to secret writing and to the question that no one before him seems to have answered in writing, not how to make a code, but how to break one. And al-Kindi wrote it down. In a manuscript with a title that means, roughly, a manuscript on deciphering cryptographic messages, in his own language, Risala fi Istikraj al-Mu'amma. And in it he described, for the first time in any surviving text we know of, a technique so simple and so devastating that it changed the balance of power between the codemaker and the codebreaker forever. We call it frequency analysis. And I'd love to walk you through it slowly, because it's one of those ideas that feels like a small magic trick until you see how it works. And then it just feels like common sense, which is the very best kind of idea to fall asleep to. Here's the heart of it. In any language, English, Arabic, any of them, the letters are not used equally. Some letters turn up constantly, again and again, and others are rare. In English, for instance, the letter E is everywhere. It's far and away the most common letter we use. Right behind it comes T. Then letters like A and O and N and I, all the busy common workhorses of the language. And down at the other end, letters like Q and Z and X that appear only now and then, shyly, hardly at all. If you took a long stretch of ordinary English writing and simply counted how often each letter appeared, you'd find this same lopsided pattern every time. E on top. Always. It's like a fingerprint of the language itself, a signature that the words leave behind no matter what they say. Now, and here's the beautiful, fatal insight, think about what a simple substitution cipher actually does to that pattern. It disguises each letter. It swaps E for some other symbol. Maybe it turns every E into a little squiggle or into the letter Q. But watch, it turns every E into that same disguise. Consistently, all through the message, and so the disguise inherits the habit of the letter underneath it. If E is the commonest letter in the language, and every E has been swapped for a squiggle, then the squiggle will be the commonest symbol in the coded message. The disguise doesn't hide how often the letter is used. It can't. The frequency shines straight through the mask. Do you see what that hands the codebreaker? Al-Kindi saw it. You don't need to try all those countless billions of possible arrangements. You don't need brute force at all. You just count. You take the enciphered message and you tally up how often each strange symbol appears. Which one shows up most? That one is almost certainly your E. The next most common? Probably your T or your A. You match the busiest symbols in the code to the busiest letters in the language, the rare symbols to the rare letters, and piece by piece, like sunlight burning off a morning fog, the hidden message begins to appear. A guess here confirms a guess there. A short common word, a the, an and, clicks into place and unlocks 3 more letters. And the whole supposedly unbreakable cipher, with all its uncountable possible keys, simply falls open in your hands. Not by trying every key, by listening to the language underneath. That was Al-Kindi's gift, and his weapon. And it's hard to overstate what it did. In a single stroke, frequency analysis took the simple substitution cipher, the one everyone had trusted, the one with more keys than there are seconds since the dawn of time, and rendered it transparent. Useless for anyone who truly needed to keep a secret from a clever enemy. For roughly 1,000 years after Al-Kindi, that whole family of ciphers was, at the highest levels, effectively dead. Broken before it was even used. Anyone with the patience to count letters could read your secret heart. And this is the moment, really, when secret breaking became a science, when cryptanalysis, the art of reading what was never meant for you, grew from lucky guesswork into a method, a discipline, a thing you could teach. The codebreakers had found their footing. And from here on, for the rest of this story, the makers and the breakers are locked together in a long, slow dance, each new lock inviting a new pick, each new pick demanding a new lock. There's one more small detail about Al-Kindi's manuscript that I find quietly wonderful, and it's a good one to drift on. His book, this foundational text, the oldest known description of the very technique that shaped 1,000 years of secrets, it was lost. For centuries, we didn't have it. We knew of frequency analysis, of course. The idea had long since spread through the world and become common knowledge among those who cared about such things. But Al-Kindi's own words, the original manuscript itself, had slipped out of view, tucked away and forgotten, the way so many treasures of that golden age were scattered and lost to time. And then, only quite recently, in 1987, it was found again. Rediscovered in an old Ottoman archive, the Süleymaniye archive, in Istanbul. More than 1,000 years after it was written, the manuscript surfaced once more into the light, and scholars could finally read, in Al-Kindi's own hand, the birth of the whole science of breaking codes. Think of that, softly, as you lie there. A secret about secrets, hidden for 1,000 years, and then gently uncovered in a library in Istanbul, patient all that time, waiting to be read. So let's take stock of where we are, quietly, before we go any further, because we've already come a long way tonight, and you may already be feeling your eyelids grow heavy, and that's exactly as it should be. We began with a queen who lost her head because her secret code was read by the very people she was hiding it from. We went back to a Spartan rod and a ribbon of leather, the transposition cipher, which keeps your letters and scrambles their order, safe only as long as the enemy can't guess the thickness of the rod. We met Julius Caesar and his shift of 3, the substitution cipher, which keeps your order and disguises your letters, undone by nothing cleverer than trying all 25 shifts. A task for an idle child. We watched people try to save substitution by scrambling the whole alphabet into an uncountable number of keys. And we watched Al-Kindi, in 9th century Baghdad, quietly dismantle all of it, not by testing those countless keys, but by simply counting letters and listening to the fingerprint of the language shining through the disguise. And notice, this is the thread I keep tugging on, gently, and I'll keep tugging on it all through this journey. Notice that every single one of these systems, the rod, the shift, the scrambled alphabet, shares the very same hidden weakness. It isn't really the weakness we've been talking about, the one the codebreakers exploited. It's a deeper one, sitting underneath. In every single case, before you can send even one secret message, you and the person you're writing to must already share a secret. You both need a rod of the same thickness. You both need to know the shift is 3. You both need the same scrambled alphabet written down somewhere. The secret always has to travel first, before the message can travel at all. Someone, somewhere, has to carry that key from one side to the other. And that someone can be followed, can be robbed, can be bribed, can be caught and made to talk. That's the 4,000-year problem. That's the water the fish never noticed. And nobody, in all these centuries we've just wandered through, thought of it as a problem to be solved at all. They thought of it the way you think of the weather, just a fact of the world you have to work around. You want to share a secret with someone far away? Then someone has to carry it there. Of course they do. How else could it possibly work? For 4,000 years, that how else could it possibly work went unanswered, because it never sounded like a question, it sounded like the end of the conversation. But it wasn't. And the people who finally turned it back into a question, who looked at that ancient immovable wall and found impossibly a door in it, are still a long way ahead of us in this story. Between here and there lie cleverer ciphers than anything Sparta or Rome or Baghdad ever dreamed of. There's a cipher that will earn the name the indecipherable one and hold it proudly for 300 years. There's a telegram that will help drag a whole nation into a world war. There's a machine, a beautiful, terrible machine of spinning wheels and wires, that an empire will bet everything on, and the quiet mathematician, far from where the legends tell you to look, who broke it first. But all of that is for a little later. For now, let the fog settle. Let the counting of letters and the winding of leather blur softly at the edges. There's no need to hold any of it too tightly. The rod, the shift, the fingerprint of the language, they'll all still be here, exactly where we left them, whenever you'd like to come back for them. For now, just rest with that one small, strange, 4,000-year-old truth, and let it carry you down towards sleep. For all those centuries, all those clever minds, the hard part was never really hiding the message. The hard part, the part nobody even knew to call a problem, was two people, far apart, who had never met, somehow agreeing on a secret in the first place, without a single soul in between them ever finding it out. And as impossible as that sounds, tonight, right now, in the dark, your own devices are doing exactly that. Quietly, constantly, solving the problem that 4,000 years called unsolvable over and over, without you ever noticing. We'll get to how. Slowly, gently, there's all the time in the world. So, the indecipherable cipher, that is what they called it for 3 centuries, give or take. Le chiffre inchiffrable. In French, because French was the language of courts and diplomats, of men who passed secrets for a living, and they wore this name like a badge of honor, the cipher that cannot be read, not by anyone, not ever, no matter how many letters you count, or how clever you think you are. And for a very long time, they were right. To understand why, you need to go back, just a little, to what all Kindi's frequency analysis actually broke. It broke the simple substitution cipher, the one where you pick a rule, one rule, and apply it to every single letter of your message from beginning to end. Caesar's three-shift. Or any other fixed mapping you like, A becomes Q and B becomes X and so on, but always the same mapping, all the way through. The problem with that, as Al-Kindi understood, is that the letters carry their identity with them even in disguise. E is still the most common letter in English, even if you've dressed it up as a symbol shaped like a small anchor. Count the anchors. You'll find E. The structure of the language is too strong to hide behind one costume. But what if you didn't use one costume? What if you used many? That is the idea, and it is a genuinely beautiful one, simple enough to explain in a breath. Instead of one fixed shift, you use a keyword. Say your keyword is the word moon. To encrypt the first letter of your message, you shift by M, the 13th letter of the alphabet, so a shift of 13 places. To encrypt the second letter, you shift by O, the 15th letter, a shift of 15. The third by the next O, 15 again. The fourth by N, a shift of 14. Then you cycle back, the fifth letter gets the M shift again, the sixth the O, and so on, for the entire message. Every letter in the ciphertext is produced by a different rule, cycling through the letters of your keyword over and over. What does that do to frequency analysis? It scrambles it. Beautifully, because now all those E's in your original message, the most common letter in English, don't land on the same symbol every time. Depending on where they fall in the cycle, they might become any one of 4 different disguises, spread across the ciphertext in a muddle. The neat frequency signature that all Kindi could read like a fingerprint is now smeared, blurred, pulled apart. You look at the ciphertext and the frequencies tell you almost nothing useful. Almost, the method of using a repeating keyword this way was first described in print in 1553 by an Italian cryptographer named Giovan Battista Bellasso. Bellasso, that is the name worth pausing on, because you will almost certainly never have heard it, and the name most people have heard instead is Blaise de Vigenère, a French diplomat who described a related system somewhat later and got the credit anyway, in the way that things so often get credited to the person with the better biography or the more impressive title. The cipher the textbooks call the Vigenère cipher should really be called the Bellasso cipher if we were being strict about it. History, like cryptography, is not always as orderly as we'd like. But de Vigenère's name is the one that stuck, and the cipher itself, whatever we call it, was the one that earned that proud French label. Le chiffre indéchiffrable. The undecipherable cipher. For roughly 3 centuries, nobody published a method to break it. 3 centuries is a long time. Think of everything that happened between 1553 and the middle of the 19th century. Empires rose and crumbled. The printing press remade the world. Galileo and Newton happened. The American and French revolutions happened. 300 years of diplomatic correspondence, military secrets, letters between conspirators, all of it potentially sheltered behind this cycling keyword trick, all of it resting on the comfortable assumption that nobody had found a crack. And then Charles Babbage found one. You may know the name Babbage from another story, The Difference Engine. the analytical engine, the Victorian-era calculating machine he dreamed of but never quite finished, the precursor to the mechanical computer. That Babbage. He lived in a world of gears and logical mechanisms, and when he turned his attention to ciphers around 1854, he thought about the cycling keyword in a new way. Here is what he noticed. A repeating keyword creates a repeating pattern. The keyword moon is 4 letters long, so the cycle repeats every 4 characters. Now imagine you have a long encrypted message. Somewhere in that message there will be a word or a short phrase in the original plaintext that just happens to sit at the same position in the cycle as an identical word or phrase somewhere else in the message. Both get encrypted by the same sequence of keyword letters. Both produce the same sequence of ciphertext symbols. And that means the ciphertext has repeated strings in it, and the distance between those repeated strings is a multiple of the keyword length. So here is the trick. You scan the ciphertext, looking for any strings of letters that repeat. A sequence of 3 or 4 or 5 symbols that shows up more than once. You write down the distance between each pair of repeats. Then, you look for the common factors in all those distances. If the keyword is 4 letters long, many of those distances will be divisible by 4. The number 4 keeps appearing in the arithmetic. The keyword length reveals itself, not directly, but as a shadow in the mathematics, the way you can sometimes see the shape of something hidden under a cloth. Once you know the keyword length, say it's 4, you split the ciphertext into 4 separate streams. The first stream is all the ciphertext letters that were encrypted with the first keyword letter. The second stream is all the letters encrypted with the second keyword letter, and so on. Each individual stream is now just a simple Caesar-style cipher with a fixed shift, exactly the kind Al-Kindi knew how to break. You count the frequencies in each stream, match the peaks to E and T and the rest, and you peel the keyword off 1 letter at a time. The indecipherable cipher, deciphered. Babbage cracked it. But here is the strange part. He never published. The notes exist, historians have found them, but no paper, no announcement, nothing to claim the glory. Some historians suggest, tentatively, that he may have been asked to stay quiet by British intelligence, that the method was useful during the Crimean War and secrecy served the Crown. That is plausible, and it is the kind of story that has a satisfying shape, though the full truth is not entirely certain. What is certain is that the credit went to someone else. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Kasiski had been working on the same problem independently. In 1863, he published a book, Die Geheimschriften und die Dechiffrekunst, Cryptography and the Art of Deciphering, and laid out the method in full, clearly, for anyone to read. The repeated string search, the common factor analysis, the splitting into streams. It works. Here it is. The world was welcome to it. The technique has been called the Kasiski examination ever since. Not the Babbage examination. History, again, doing what history does. And with Kasiski's publication, the 3-century reign of Le Chiffre Inchiffrable was over. The polyalphabetic substitution cipher, the cycling keyword, the whole elegant mechanism, it was broken, finally and completely, added to the long list of once unbreakable things that turned out to be breakable after all. That list, you may be noticing, is remarkably consistent. Every cipher in this story gets its moment of invincibility. Every one eventually falls. The citale fell to anyone who found the rod. The Caesar cipher fell to a child with patience. Al-Kindi's frequency analysis fell to the polyalphabetic cipher, and the polyalphabetic cipher fell to Babbage and Kasiski. There is a rhythm to it, if you listen, a kind of slow, patient tide, confidence building until the wave breaks. And then the next wave begins to build. But before we move forward in time to the waves that came next, let's go back, because there is a story we left waiting. A story from before Babbage, before Kasiski, from the years when the indecipherable cipher was still being taken at its word. A story about a queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, was in her mid-40s and had been a prisoner for nearly 2 decades when her own handwriting, or rather the shadow of it in symbols, was finally used against her. She had been a queen twice over, of Scotland and briefly of France, and she was the Catholic claimant to the English throne that Elizabeth I sat on. Elizabeth was Protestant. Mary's existence was, in that sense, a permanent political problem, a focus for Catholic conspirators, a rallying point for anyone who wished the English throne to change its religion and its occupant. Elizabeth kept her imprisoned, and in that imprisonment Mary kept writing letters. She had to be careful. Her letters were watched, intercepted, read, so she used a cipher. A particular kind of cipher called a nomenclator, a hybrid system that combined a substitution alphabet where specific symbols stood for letters with a separate dictionary of code words where particular symbols stood for entire words or names. Common words like the, and got their own dedicated symbols. Important names, Elizabeth, France, the King of Spain, got dedicated code words too. It was more complex than a simple Caesar shift, more resistant to the basic kind of frequency analysis that would dispatch a pure substitution cipher. It felt, to Mary and to those she corresponded with, adequately secure. In 1586, a young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington wrote to her with a plan. The plan was to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne, with the support of a Spanish invasion from abroad. Babington outlined it in careful, ciphered detail. Mary wrote back. She acknowledged the plan. She asked for specific information about the conspirators who would carry it out. She had no idea that her letters were being read by a very small, very capable man named Thomas Phelippes. Phelippes worked for Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Elizabeth's spymaster, a man so effective at his work that he has been called, not unfairly, the father of the modern intelligence service. Walsingham had arranged with considerable care for Mary's letters to pass through a route that he controlled. They went into and out of her rooms through a concealed channel in a barrel, as part of a covert arrangement supposedly being run on her behalf. In fact, every letter was extracted, copied, deciphered, read, and resealed before being passed on. Phelippes was the one doing the deciphering. He was, by all accounts, slight and pockmarked and largely unremarkable in appearance, fluent in French, Italian, Latin, and Spanish, and almost supernaturally gifted at breaking ciphers. Mary's nomenclator, its substitution symbols, its code words, yielded to him. He read Babington's letter, and then he read Mary's reply, sitting alone with those intercepted sheets, knowing what they meant. But Walsingham wanted more than Mary's reply. He wanted the names of the 6 gentlemen Babington had mentioned in his letter, the ones actually designated to carry out the assassination. Mary's reply had not named them. So Phelippes did something extraordinary and deeply cynical. He forged an additional postscript to Mary's letter in her own cipher, appearing to be in her own hand, asking Babington to send the names. The forgery was so clean that Babington replied. He gave the names. That was that. Babington and his co-conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed. Mary was tried before a commission, and the ciphered letters, the real ones and the forged postscript, though the forgery's role has been debated by historians, were read into the record as evidence against her. She was convicted of conspiring to murder the Queen. On the 8th of February 1587, in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. She was 44 years old. She had been a prisoner for 18 years, and the cipher she had trusted to keep her safe, the cipher she believed her jailers could not read, had been opened to her enemies for months before she sent a single word. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. All that care. The symbols and the code words and the hidden barrel. The careful, meticulous effort to keep the words secret. And none of it mattered, because a quiet man in a room had simply read the whole thing long before she knew he could. The cipher was not unbreakable. It was only unbroken until it wasn't. And the consequence was a life. Let the room settle around you. If you're somewhere dark and warm, notice that. The darkness, the warmth. There's no urgency here. We have all the time in the dark to move through these stories slowly, one by one, letting each one find its own weight before we set it down and lift the next. The next one is bigger in scale, though no less human in its pieces. 3 centuries after Mary, a different war, a different world, a different kind of secret, and a single piece of encrypted text that helped change the map of the 20th century. The year is 1917. The First World War has been grinding for nearly 3 years. On the Western Front, the front lines have barely moved. The United States is officially neutral, though American public opinion is complicated. Complicated by the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, complicated by German submarine warfare and the deaths of American civilians, complicated by the enormous political and ethnic diversity of a young country still figuring out where it belongs in a European war. Woodrow Wilson has won re-election in 1916, partly on the promise of keeping America out of the fighting. Inside the Admiralty building in London, in a suite of rooms on the first floor, a small group of men and women are doing something that would have looked, to an outside eye, remarkably quiet. They are surrounded by charts and papers and pencils. They work long hours at plain tables. They are intercepting German military and diplomatic communications and breaking them. This unit is called Room 40, formerly the Naval Intelligence Division's code-breaking section. The name comes, blandly, from the room number in the old Admiralty building where the work began. By 1917, it has grown into something considerable, a serious intelligence operation staffed by academics, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, and an assortment of people whose minds work sideways rather than straight, which turns out to be exactly what cryptanalysis requires. On the 16th of January 1917, the German Foreign Secretary, a man named Arthur Zimmermann, sent an encrypted telegram from Berlin to the German ambassador in Washington, with instructions to forward it to the German minister in Mexico City. The telegram used a German diplomatic cipher. It was routed partly through Swedish communications channels and partly through American diplomatic channels, an irony, the Americans carrying a message aimed partly at themselves, and it was intercepted by the British. 2 men in Room 40 worked on it. One was a young intelligence officer named Neal de Grey. The other was a Church of England vicar, the Reverend William Montgomery, whose career had somehow brought him to the business of deciphering German diplomatic traffic. Between them, de Grey and Montgomery pulled the telegram apart, and what they read was, even by the standards of a world already at war, remarkable. Zimmermann was proposing to the Mexican government that if the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should form an alliance with Germany. In return, Germany would provide financial support and would help Mexico recover. And here Zimmermann used the precise phrase, the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, territories that had been part of Mexico until the mid-19th century, and whose loss still carried some weight in Mexican national memory. Zimmermann was dangling them like a prize in exchange for Mexico's willingness to keep the Americans busy on their southern border. De Grey and Montgomery knew, sitting with this document, that they were holding something with enormous potential consequences. The problem was how to use it. Because here is the difficulty. If you reveal to your enemy that you have been reading their communications, they change their codes. Immediately, and all the work that allowed you to read their messages, all the painstaking reconstruction of their cipher systems, all of it becomes worthless overnight. The intelligence is only as valuable as the secrecy of how you got it. Room 40 had been protecting that secret carefully, and this telegram, too good to waste, too dangerous to simply hand over unchanged, required careful handling. The solution British intelligence arrived at was elegant and slightly devious. They obtained a copy of the telegram as it had been relayed within Mexico itself through Mexican telegraph networks. And that version had been encoded with an older, slightly different German cipher, one the British were also able to read, but one that it was less damaging to expose. This gave them plausible cover. They could present the telegram to the Americans as having been obtained through Mexican sources, implying human intelligence rather than signals intelligence, obscuring the depth of their code-breaking capabilities. In late February 1917, the British passed the decoded telegram to the American government. Walter Hines Page, the US ambassador in London, received it and transmitted it to Washington, where it landed on the desk of President Wilson. On the 1st of March 1917, the text of the Zimmermann telegram was published in the American press. The effect was immediate and enormous. The public outrage was not theoretical. Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, named explicitly in a German foreign secretary's own words, made the threat feel concrete and immediate and close to home in a way that European trench warfare never quite had. Letters poured into Congress. Newspaper editors wrote at pitch. The political centre shifted. There were those who suspected the telegram was a forgery, a British fabrication designed to drag the United States into a war it didn't want. Zimmermann himself resolved that question in one of the stranger moments in diplomatic history by simply confirming it. He admitted publicly that he had sent it. His reasoning, apparently, was that the alliance had been conditional and the conditions hadn't been met, so there was nothing to be embarrassed about. The logic did not land as intended. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Room 40's secret held. The German military and diplomatic services continued using their cipher systems, unaware that the British had been reading them. The deception, the careful construction of an alternative provenance for the telegram, worked, and somewhere in the Admiralty building, Nigel de Grey and Reverend Montgomery continued their quiet work at their plain tables, surrounded by papers and pencils, while the world outside rearranged itself around what they had read. History pivots on extraordinary moments, and not all of them are loud. Some of them are a man at a table, in a cold room, working through a cipher, and the thing he finds on the other side changes everything that comes after, for a generation. That is enough to carry with you into the soft dark of wherever you are. A telegram, a pair of code breakers, 3 state names in someone else's handwriting, and a war that turned on a secret that wasn't quite secret enough. Notice your breath for a moment. There's no need to hold the timeline perfectly or to keep all the names in neat order. They'll arrange themselves on their own, the way things do when you stop gripping them. Walsingham and Phelippes and the forged postscript, Zimmermann and de Grey and the telegram routing through Mexican channels. They belong to the same long story, the story of people believing their secrets were safe, the story of other people quietly, patiently, proving that they were not. And both of those stories end in the same place, with the question that was always underneath, the question nobody had fully articulated yet as a question. Not how do you hide the message? How do you agree on the hiding in the first place? Because Phelippes was brilliant, yes, de Grey and Montgomery were brilliant. But part of what made their work possible was something structural. The people whose messages they were reading had to share their cipher systems somehow. Mary and Babington needed a common understanding of the substitution symbols between them. The German diplomatic service had to distribute its codebooks, its cipher keys, to its embassies around the world. Every embassy, every ambassador, every chancellor's office, someone had to carry those keys there, physically, in a case or a pouch, trusting that no one intercepted the courier. And the courier, however careful, is a vulnerability. The key, however complex the cipher it unlocks, is a weak point. The distribution of secrets is the hidden seam in every encrypted system, the place where the whole architecture becomes human and therefore fallible. Mary's cipher key was the system of symbols she and Babington agreed to use. We don't know exactly how they established it, presumably through trusted intermediaries before the correspondence began. But an intermediary can talk, a messenger can be caught, a codebook can be stolen. The German diplomatic ciphers were not broken through a flash of pure mathematical insight in every case. Some of the work in Room 40 was made possible by captured codebooks, by German ships sunk with their cipher materials still aboard, by the human and operational failures that accompany any large bureaucracy running a war. The cipher itself was only the wall, the key was the door. And the door was always the weakness. Mary, Queen of Scots, trusted her door. The German Foreign Office trusted its doors, its couriers, its codebook distribution. Neither trust turned out to be warranted. For 4,000 years, from the scytale wound on its rod to the Zimmermann telegram ticking through the cables, this is the thing that cryptographers had not quite named as the problem they were trying to solve. They had been making the wall stronger and stronger, more elaborate, harder to scale. Scytale to Caesar, to nomenclator to polyalphabetic cipher, each more complex than the last. Each eventually overcome. But the door. The key distribution. The question of how two people, separated by distance, surrounded by enemies, with no trusted intermediary, could possibly agree on a secret and then keep it, that question had no answer. It was not, for most of this history, even being asked. It was simply accepted. You need a key. Someone must carry the key. You must trust the carrier. If the carrier fails, everything fails. That is life. The war that the Zimmermann telegram helped start, the First World War, would give rise, in the years that followed, to the next great wave of cryptographic machinery. The next era. The era of the beautiful, terrible spinning machine. But that is where we're going next. We don't need to hurry toward it. It will be there, waiting, the rotors turning slowly in the dark, whenever we're ready. For now, if your eyes are heavy, let them be heavy. The names can drift and blur, Belasso and Vigenra, Babbage and Kasiski, Mary and Phelippes, Zimmermann and de Grey. They've been placed in the story now, and they'll hold their shape whether you're watching them or not. The pattern underneath them, the thing they all share, is simple enough to carry into sleep without any effort at all. Every unbreakable cipher in this story was broken. Every one. And the reason was always, in some sense, the same reason. Not that the cipher itself was weak, though in the end they all were, in one way or another, but that the thing keeping it together, the shared secret at the centre, the key, always had to travel somehow. And anything that travels can be caught. There is something almost restful about that, if you hold it lightly enough. The ingenuity, the centuries of effort, the queens and generals and diplomats and mathematicians, all of them were working on the wall, and the door was quietly, patiently, doing what doors do. Somewhere further along this story, a different kind of person will ask a different kind of question. Not how do we make the wall stronger, but what if we didn't need a door at all? What if there were a way to have a shared secret without ever sharing it? That sounds like nonsense, and for a very long time it would have been received as nonsense. The kind of thing you say when you haven't understood the problem. Because, of course, a shared secret must be shared, the word is right there. You cannot both know something that only one of you was told. Except, it turns out, that is not quite true. Not quite. But that is later. That is another part of the dark, another quiet stretch of this slow journey through all the clever and desperate and brilliant things human beings have done to keep their words from other human beings' eyes. For now there is one more chapter before the machines, one more chapter of that particular, elegant, heartbreaking ingenuity, the attempt to hide the message well enough, the attempt to make the wall high enough, this time that the wall itself will be enough, this time for certain, this time forever. The machine believed, and very nearly delivered, exactly that promise. And it was wrong, but it was wrong in ways that took some of the most extraordinary minds of the 20th century to discover, working in silence in an English country house, in a race against a clock that was reset mercilessly every day at midnight. Let the room grow quiet around you. If there's a light still on somewhere, it can stay on. If you have a blanket, it can stay warm. We're almost there. The machine began, as so many things begin, with a salesman's dream. Arthur Scherbius was a German electrical engineer, and around 1918, as the First World War was grinding to its exhausted close, he had an idea. Not a military idea at first, a commercial one. He imagined offices, banks, shipping companies, the whole humming apparatus of modern business, and he thought about how much of their correspondence was sensitive, how much of it travelled by telegraph over wires that anyone could tap, how much money and reputation depended on keeping certain numbers and certain arrangements from certain eyes. He thought there should be a machine for this. The machine he patented was called Enigma. It was beautiful in its way. A wooden box, roughly the size of a typewriter, that you could carry under your arm. A keyboard on the front, the standard 26 letters of the German alphabet arranged in that familiar quartz pattern. Above the keyboard, a lamp board, 26 small windows, one for each letter, each with a tiny bulb behind it. And inside, the real ingenuity, a set of rotating wired wheels, the rotors, each one about the size of a thick drink coaster, each one with 26 contacts on each face, wired through the interior in a pattern that was different for every rotor. Here is how it worked, slowly, and there is no hurry tonight. You press a key, say, the letter A. That keystroke sends a small electrical current on a journey. The current travels first through a plugboard, which the Germans called the Steckerbrett, a panel at the front of the machine where pairs of letters were physically connected by cables, swapping them before anything else happened. So A might become, say, K, before it went any further. Then the current entered the rotors. In the military version there were 3 of them in a row, each one a tangle of internal wiring that transformed the letter one more time. The current passed through the first rotor, came out as something else. Passed through the second, something else again. Passed through the third. But then something happened that is quite unlike anything in the ciphers we have talked about so far. The current hit a reflector. A fixed wheel at the far end, wired so that it always sent the current back through the third rotor, the second, the first, back through the plugboard, and finally it lit up a lamp. The letter that lamp showed, that was your enciphered letter. You wrote it down. And here is the elegant thing, and the seeds of the machine's own eventual undoing, because the current went through and then came back. The machine was its own inverse. If you set both machines to identical settings and typed the ciphertext on one, the plaintext lit up on the other. Sender and receiver needed only to agree on the starting configuration, and the cipher was fully symmetric. No complex lookup tables. The machine did everything. But the rotors also moved. After every single key press, the first rotor advanced one position, like the unit wheel on an odometer. After it completed a full turn, it nudged the second rotor, and so on. This meant the substitution changed with every single letter. Press the letter A twice in a row, and you got 2 completely different ciphered letters back. The cipher was not just one scrambled alphabet, it was a different scrambled alphabet for every character in your message. Simple frequency analysis, the weapon al-Kindi had invented in 9th century Baghdad, was now useless. There was no repeated pattern to count. The total number of possible configurations of the military enigma, accounting for rotor choice, rotor order, starting positions, and the plugboard settings, was something on the order of 150 million. That is roughly 10 to the power of 23. If you want a picture of that number, imagine trying to search through it manually, checking one configuration per second. You would not live long enough to reach the end, not even close. You would need the entire age of the universe and more, and yet. There was one structural fact about Enigma that its designers, perhaps proud of the elegance, left in place. Because the current went in and came back through the same reflector, no letter could ever encipher to itself. Press A, and you might get B, C, D, anything, but you would never ever get A. It was a mathematical certainty built into the machine's heart. That single fact, small and innocuous, would eventually bring it down. But not yet. Not in 1918, when Arthur Scherbius took his beautiful invention first to the German Navy, who showed little interest, then to the wider market. He exhibited it publicly. He tried to sell it to governments, to businesses, to banks. He was not especially successful. Not at first. And then the German military, thinking carefully about what the Great War had taught them about communication and signals and the catastrophic vulnerability of transmitted messages, changed their minds. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, had adopted modified, more complex versions of Scherbius's machine as their primary cipher system. Each service had its own variants. They generated daily settings lists, distributed securely in advance. Every morning at midnight, the settings changed. Yesterday's keys were gone forever. The messages that passed through Enigma, the German military believed, were safe, were completely, permanently, practically safe. They were wrong. But they would not know that for years. And the people who first discovered how wrong they were not British, they were Polish, and their names deserve to be said clearly and remembered. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Ricki, Henryk Cygalski, three mathematicians working in Warsaw for the Polish Cipher Bureau, the Bureau Cyfru. And what they did, quietly, with pencil and paper and a rigorous kind of mathematical courage, is one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the 20th century and one of the least celebrated outside their homeland. To understand what Rejewski did, you need to know something about how mathematics can describe patterns in machines. The theory of permutations, the branch of mathematics that deals with how you can rearrange a set of things, turns out to be exactly the right language for describing what a rotor does. A rotor takes a letter and maps it to another letter. That is a permutation. And permutations, when you compose them, when you feed the output of one into another, obey a set of clean, elegant rules that mathematicians had been studying for decades, entirely independent of any question about secret codes. Rejewski looked at Enigma not as a machine, but as a mathematical object. He wrote down equations that described what each rotor, each plugboard configuration, each reflector position was doing, as permutations, as algebraic structures, and then he started working backwards from intercepted messages, looking for patterns in the underlying algebra. He was helped. Not by luck, not entirely. In 1931, a French intelligence operative made contact with Hans Thilo Schmidt, a German with access to documents he should not have had access to, specifically operating manuals and key lists for military Enigma. The French intelligence service, working under a source they called Asher, photographed these documents and then, somewhat to their own embarrassment, found they did not know quite what to do with them. They passed them to the Poles, who had more at stake. Poland sat between Germany and the Soviet Union. It had only regained independence in 1918. Its cryptanalysts were working with a desperation the French and British did not yet feel. The documents from Schmidt told Rejewski something crucial: the internal wiring of the rotors. Not everything, but enough to set his equations on solid ground and start solving them. What he did next in 1932 took his colleagues' breath away. He recovered the internal wiring of all three military rotors, essentially reconstructed the mathematical structure of the machine using the documents combined with his own algebraic methods. And then, working with the logical architecture of how the machine operated rather than brute forcing the key space, he and his colleagues found a way to narrow down the settings for any given day. The Poles built their own Enigma replicas, accurate enough to test against. They built electromechanical devices they called bomb, perhaps for the ticking sound, or perhaps for the fizzing tension of the moment when a possible solution emerged. They developed sheets of paper with perforated patterns designed by Henryk Cygalski, that when overlaid in careful combinations could narrow down the settings further. They called these the Cygalski sheets. For years, through the middle of the 1930s, they read German signals. Not all of them, not quickly enough to do everything with them. But they read them. They understood the machine. They had climbed inside its logic. And then Germany changed the machine. More rotors, a larger selection. More plugboard connections, changed operational procedures, changing more frequently. The haystack grew. The bomber designs needed to multiply. The Zygalski sheets needed to be remade at a new, almost impractical scale. And the resources needed, the sheer number of sheets, the mechanical complexity, were pushing past what Polish intelligence could fund or staff. And then the news from Germany grew darker and darker, and the shape of what was coming became hard to deny. In late July of 1939, the Polish Cipher Bureau invited British and French intelligence representatives to a meeting near Warsaw. What they presented in that room must have felt to the visitors like a dream. The Poles laid out everything, every insight, every method, their reconstructed Enigma machines, the bomber designs, the Zygalski sheets, the mathematical foundations Rejewski had developed over 7 years of quiet, brilliant, underfunded work. They gave it all away. 5 weeks before Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, think about that for a moment. That is what it means to know what is coming. The Poles gave away the most valuable intelligence asset they possessed because they knew they would not have the time to use it, and because they believed, they had to believe, that the knowledge itself placed in British and French hands might matter in the fight ahead. It was an act of extraordinary, clear-eyed generosity, and it changed the course of the war that was about to begin. Marian Rejewski survived the war. He lived until 1980. He was eventually recognized in Poland, quietly, in his later years. But for a long time, for decades after the war, the entire story was kept secret. Because the secret had been kept so well that admitting Enigma had been broken might have compromised other intelligence work. The men who broke Enigma first spent decades unable to say what they had done. In Britain, the intelligence that arrived from Warsaw went to a country house in the English countryside, 50 miles north of London, at a place called Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was, on the outside, an unremarkable Victorian mansion surrounded by a scattering of wooden huts that had been thrown up as the work expanded. Inside, behind layers of classification so absolute that people working in adjacent huts sometimes did not know what the other hut was doing, was one of the greatest concentrations of intellectual talent ever assembled for a single task. Mathematicians, chess players, classicists, crossword enthusiasts, linguists, people who were good at thinking sideways, at seeing patterns, at sitting patiently with a thing that was almost making sense and waiting for the moment it did. The logic they inherited from the Poles was this: the Enigma machine, for all its astronomical key space, could never encipher a letter as itself. That meant something. That meant that if you had a guess about what a stretch of ciphertext might say, if you had reason to think a particular weather report would contain the word wetter, or that a message sent from a particular station at a particular time would begin with a particular greeting, you could test your guess against the ciphertext and rule out any machine configuration that caused one of your guessed letters to be enciphered as itself. These guesses were called cribs, and they were more plentiful than you might expect. Human beings are creatures of habit. German radio operators, typing their messages into the machine in the cold pre-dawn hours, tended to fall into routines. A station in the North Sea that always reported the weather at the same time every morning always reported something recognizably weather-like. Messages that began with standardized military headers. Words like keine besonderen Ergebnisse, nothing to report, that had a way of appearing in the same predictable places. Even something as small as a man who liked to start messages with his girlfriend's name, encoded, All of it was pattern. All of it was crib material. Alan Turing, who had arrived at Bletchley in 1939 and who had been thinking about certain kinds of logical machines in the abstract even before the war, designed a machine that could test these cribs at speed. The Bombay, the name borrowed from the Polish bomber, was a large copper-coloured cabinet packed with drums, each drum representing a rotor simulation, each rotating and clicking through possible configurations. The machine could test the implications of a crib against the logical constraints of the Enigma and eliminate configurations that produced contradictions. Gordon Welchman made it vastly more powerful. He realized that the plugboard connections, instead of being a blind complication, could be turned into a source of additional constraints. He developed what became known as the diagonal board, a piece of additional wiring that allowed the bomb to propagate implications through the plugboard connections automatically, eliminating far more configurations with each step. Turing, when Welchman showed him, was reportedly surprised and impressed. The diagonal board transformed the bomb from a useful machine into a machine that could actually win. But here is something the films and the popular stories often leave out, because it is harder to dramatize than a single heroic mind sitting alone with an equation. Traffic analysis. Long before a single message was deciphered, long before a crib was even identified, the signals analysts at Bletchley were learning things from the raw shape of German communications. Which stations transmitted at what times, how often, how much, how urgently? Which call signs appeared together in the same network? When traffic volume spiked, which often meant something was about to happen, and where the traffic was flowing. A commander in the field does not transmit when nothing is happening. An increase in traffic from a particular sector, even encrypted traffic, signals activity. A radio operator has a way of touching the key that experienced listeners can almost identify, the way you might recognize a friend's handwriting without reading the words. These patterns, who was talking to whom, when, and how much, were intelligence even when the content stayed dark. The signals themselves were a kind of language, separate from the words they carried. This matters because it is easy to look back at Bletchley Park and see it as a pure mathematics story, a story of genius versus machine. It was that. But it was also a story of patient, observational, almost anthropological work, the kind of attention that does not photograph well, but that in practice mattered as much as any equation. And Bletchley was even then not finished with its surprises. The Enigma machine was the cipher of the German military's operational communications, field orders, U-boat coordinates, convoy routes, Luftwaffe disposition. Vital, enormously so. But the German High Command, the most senior strategic communications, used something different. Something more complex. A teleprinter cipher machine that the British could see in operation on the airwaves but could not examine directly, because they had never captured one. They called it the Lorenz cipher after the machine that produced it. The Lorenz SZ40 and SZ42. It operated on a different principle from Enigma, using a series of rotating wheels in a pattern related to the Vernam cipher, the one-time pad idea, producing what appeared to be a stream of random characters that were then combined with the plaintext. The Germans called the system Tunny. A young mathematician named Bill Tutti was given what fragments of intercepted Lorenz traffic the analysts had managed to collect. He had never seen the machine. He would not see one for a long time. But working from the mathematics of what the output had to look like if the machine worked in a certain way, working from the structure that a Vernam-type cipher would impose on the statistical properties of the ciphertext, Tutte rebuilt the machine in his mind. He deduced the number of wheels, the sizes of the wheels, how they interacted. He reconstructed, from pure mathematical inference, the architecture of a device he had never touched. It is almost too extraordinary to say plainly. He reverse-engineered a highly secret piece of German hardware from its output alone. But analyzing Lorentz traffic required more than the bomb could offer. The calculations were too complex, the message volumes too great, the wheel patterns too intricate. What was needed was something new, something that did not yet quite exist. Tommy Flowers was a post office engineer, one of those practical, deeply skilled men who understood not the theory of a thing, but how to actually build it, how to make the theory real in copper and wire and glass. He had been working with electronic valves, vacuum tubes, and he believed that you could build a machine that operated not mechanically, with drums rotating, but purely electronically, with valves switching on and off at speeds no mechanical device could match. At Bletchley, there was skepticism. Valves were fragile. Thousands of them, as Flowers was proposing, seemed like a guarantee of constant failure. But Flowers understood something his critics did not. Valves failed, mainly when they were switched on and off. Leave them running continuously, never let them cool, and they could run for months without incident. Flowers built Colossus. Colossus, the first version, became operational at Bletchley Park in February 1944. It had 1,500 valves. The second version, Colossus Mark II, arrived in time for D-Day and had 2,400. It read a paper tape of intercepted traffic passing at 5,000 characters per second, running calculations against the possible wheel settings, searching for statistical regularities that would suggest the wheels were aligned. It did in hours what would have taken weeks by hand. Colossus is often described as the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. That description is contested. It did not do everything we mean by a general-purpose computer, but in any meaningful sense, it was an entirely new kind of machine, doing things at speeds that made previous calculation look geological in pace by comparison. And like everything else at Bletchley, it was kept almost perfectly secret for decades after the war. The machines were dismantled. The documents were classified. The people who built and operated Colossus were not permitted to speak of it. Tommy Flowers went back to the post office. He spent years unable to explain what he had done. He could not point to it in any public forum, could not claim credit, could not let it help his career. He died in 1998. The secret of Bletchley, the whole achievement, the work of thousands of people across years of unglamorous, painstaking, essential effort, held for decades. It was Churchill who called the people at Bletchley the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled, which is as fine a description of disciplined secrecy as you are likely to find. The full story did not begin to emerge publicly until the mid-1970s, and it was not comprehensively told for many years after that. So when you watch the films, remember what the films compress. Bletchley was not one man with an equation. It was thousands of people, most of them women, working in shifts in cold wooden huts, reading signals from a war that was happening somewhere else and doing quiet, necessary, invisible work so that someone, somewhere, with the information they produced, could make a decision that might cost fewer lives than it would have otherwise cost. That is what intelligence work actually looks like, most of the time. But the machines, the mathematics, the relentless mechanical ingenuity, none of it was the only way, in the Second World War, of keeping a message secret. Because on the other side of the world, in the Pacific, the United States military was using something that no amount of rotor analysis or frequency counting or valve switching could touch. They were using a language. Philip Johnston was a civil engineer, a man who had grown up on a Navajo reservation as the son of a missionary, and who, in adulthood, was one of very few people outside the Navajo community who could speak the language with any competence. He was also a veteran, and when, in 1942, he heard about the military's frustration with codes that took too long to encrypt and decode in the field, where speed was survival, he had an idea. He approached the United States Marine Corps with a proposal. The Navajo language was unlike any other language the Axis powers had encountered. It had never been written down in any standardized form. It was spoken by a community that had been largely isolated from the wider world. The grammar was extraordinarily complex, tonal in ways that defeated even professional linguists. And crucially, almost no one outside the Navajo Nation had any meaningful knowledge of it. There were estimated to be fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the world in 1942 who could understand it at all. The Marines were skeptical. They had tried language-based codes before, in the First World War, using Choctaw speakers, with some success. But the programs had not been developed systematically. Johnston pressed. He arranged a demonstration, transmitting military messages in Navajo. The officers who witnessed it were convinced. In the spring of 1942, the first group of Navajo recruits was enlisted. There were about 29 of them in that original cohort, young men who found themselves asked to serve in a war and to bring with them something that was entirely, uniquely theirs, their language, the language of the reservation, the language of their grandparents. They built the code together, this first small group, devising a system that worked in two complementary ways. Some Navajo words were used directly, through association. The Navajo word for turtle became a tank, iron fish was submarine, war chief was a commanding general, big gun was artillery. The associations were concrete, imaginable, chosen so they could be remembered quickly under pressure. Then, for spelling out proper nouns and technical terms that had no natural Navajo equivalent, there was an alphabet system, where Navajo words stood for letters. So you could spell core as the Navajo words for corn, owl, rabbit, pig, snake. It was fast. A coded message that might take a trained Marine half an hour to encipher by conventional means could be transmitted and received by two Navajo code talkers in about 20 seconds. Under fire, in the heat of an island assault, 20 seconds versus 30 minutes was the difference between a coordinate reaching the right people in time and reaching them too late. And it was never broken. Japanese signals intelligence intercepted the transmissions. They knew something important was being communicated. They could hear the Navajo words. They could recognize that it was a structured, systematic exchange with a clear purpose. But they could not begin to decode it, because the language itself was the first layer of security, and the code built on top of the language added a second layer that was only meaningful to those inside. The code talkers served at Guadalcanal, at Iwo Jima, across the Pacific Campaign. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, reportedly said afterward that the Marines would not have taken the island without the Navajo code talkers. The program remained classified until 1968. The original recruits received Congressional Gold Medals in 2001. They had kept the secret for 23 years after it no longer needed to be kept, because they had been told to keep it, and they did. There is something worth staying with for a moment before we move on. The Navajo Code works on a completely different principle from everything else in this story. Every cipher we have talked about, the citale, the Caesar shift, al-Kindi's substitutions, the Vigenère polyalphabets, Enigma, every one of them assumes that the underlying language, the alphabet, the structure of what you are trying to hide, is known to your adversary. That is the game. They know English, you know they know English, so you try to make the English unrecognizable. The Navajo Code changed the game entirely. The language was the cipher, and the cipher was the language, and the two could not be separated. You could not use frequency analysis, because frequency analysis depends on knowing which characters map to which. You could not use mathematical permutation theory, because there was no alphabet to permute in any familiar sense. You could not build a bomb to test it, because there were no rotors, no settings, nothing mechanical to attack. It was, in its way, the most human solution to the problem of secrecy that the war produced. Not elegant in a mathematical sense, elegant in a human sense. It drew on something completely particular to a specific community of people, their history, their isolation, their language, and made that particularity a fortress. And it held. Settle in now, if you are still with me. The room is quiet. The night has deepened around wherever you are. We have travelled a long way tonight already, from the leather strips on a Spartan rod to the huts of Bletchley Park to the Pacific Islands where men spoke words their enemies could not dream of translating. But the story is not finished. The most extraordinary part of it is still ahead. Because all of this, the Enigma and the bomb and the Lorenz cipher and Colossus and the Navajo code talkers and the whole magnificent, desperate, brilliant effort, all of this was still, at its heart, the same ancient problem wearing new clothes. Somewhere, someone had to share the key. The German army distributed its Enigma settings on printed key lists, delivered by courier, sealed, to every station that needed them. The Navajo code talkers were themselves the key. They had to be physically present, trained, trusted, irreplaceable. Every cipher system that existed in 1945 as in 1945 BC rested on the same assumption: before you could encrypt, you had to meet, or send someone you trusted to meet on your behalf, or trust a system that someone had set up in advance. And that person, that meeting, that system, they were always the weak point. They were always what the enemy could try to find, bribe, intercept, threaten, follow, or break. For 4,000 years, every advance in cryptography had tried to make the message harder to read. Not one of them had solved the problem of the key. That problem was so deeply embedded in the nature of the thing that most people who thought about cryptography did not even frame it as a problem to be solved. It was just the nature of secrets. You could not share a secret without sharing it. The sentence was its own proof. You wanted to send something private. Well, first you had to tell the other person how to understand the private thing. And that telling was itself something that had to be kept private, and so you were already back at the beginning. Except there was a man in a sun-bright office in California who had begun to think about it differently. And in 1976, something happened that made 4,000 years of cryptography look, in retrospect, like a long detour around a question nobody had thought to ask. But that is the next part of this dark and gentle journey. That is where we are going next, into the mathematics of something that should not work and does. something that lets two strangers share a secret in full public view, shouting the pieces of it in a room where everyone can hear, and still walking away with something that no one listening has. Rest here for a moment if you want to. There is no rush. The night is generous. The ideas will keep. So here we are. It is late now, wherever you are. The lamp is low, or the room is dark, or you are listening with your eyes already closed, the voice just something warm to drift alongside. That is exactly right. We have come a long way tonight, through Sparta and Baghdad and 16th century Scotland and the wireless rooms of Bletchley, through machines with rotors and reflectors and plugboards, through a war that turned on a cipher and a war that turned on a telegram, through Polish mathematicians handing over their finest secret in a forest meeting, 5 weeks before everything broke apart. And we ended, just a moment ago, with the problem. The permanent problem. The one that no amount of clever scrambling had ever touched. You could not share a secret without first sharing the key. And the key always needed a courier, and the courier was always the weakest link in the chain. Let us go now, gently, into what happened next, because something did happen. Something quiet and extraordinary, and almost geometrically beautiful. Something that changed the mathematics of secrets more completely than anything in the previous 4,000 years. It begins, as so many things in this story begin, with one person thinking very carefully about something that everyone else had decided was simply the way things were. Claude Shannon was working at Bell Labs in New Jersey in the years after the Second World War. He had done classified work on cryptography during the war itself, and out of that work came a paper. He published it in 1949 in the Bell System Technical Journal, and he called it Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems. It is one of those papers that changes the shape of a field so completely that after it, the field is a different thing. What Shannon did was bring cryptography out of the arts and into mathematics. Not just the clever application of mathematics the way Rajewski had done, but mathematics all the way down. He asked a precise question. He said, what does it actually mean for a cipher to be secure? Not secure in practice. Not secure for now. Perfectly secure. Unconditionally secure. Secure in a way that no amount of computation, no amount of time, no enemy, however clever, could ever break. And he answered it. The answer is elegant and slightly heartbreaking, depending on how you look at it. He defined something he called perfect secrecy. A cipher has perfect secrecy, Shannon showed, if the ciphertext tells you absolutely nothing about the plaintext. Not merely very little. Nothing, every possible message, is equally consistent with what you intercepted. You might have captured an order to attack at dawn. You might have captured a grocery list. You might have captured a love letter. The ciphertext without the key cannot distinguish between them. An enemy with infinite computing power and infinite time learns exactly as much from perfect secrecy ciphertext as from a blank page, which is to say, nothing at all. He proved that exactly one cryptographic system achieves perfect secrecy. The one-time pad. You may have heard of it. It is almost comically simple in description. You take your message. You take a string of random characters that is at least as long as the message, truly random, generated properly, not a pattern disguised as randomness. You combine them, letter by letter or bit by bit, and what comes out is the ciphertext. The key is used once, and then it is discarded. It is never used again, never reused, not for a second message, not for a postscript. That is all. That is the one-time pad. It had been around in various forms before Shannon proved its perfection. A version appears in a codebook written by a man named Frank Miller in 1882, though this early form went largely unnoticed. Later, an engineer named Gilbert Vernon patented a practical version in 1919, a system that combined message tape with a key tape in an automatic telegraph machine, one character at a time. And a military officer named Joseph Mowbourne recognized what Vernon had done and insisted on the crucial requirement: the key tape must be truly random and must never repeat. That insistence was what made it unbreakable. That insistence was the whole thing. Shannon proved it. He showed with mathematical precision that the one-time pad is the only system that achieves perfect secrecy. Every other cipher in the world, every substitution, every transposition, every rotor machine, every polyalphabetic cipher, every brilliant invention you have heard about in the last few hours, every one of them falls short of this standard. Every one of them leaks at least some information, at least in principle, to an adversary with enough resources and time. The one-time pad does not. The one-time pad is the thing Al-Kindi's frequency analysis cannot touch, because the ciphertext has no frequency patterns to analyze. The one-time pad is the thing the bomb cannot cycle through, because there are no cribs to exploit. It is perfect, and it is proven perfect, and that proof has stood for 75 years without anyone finding a crack. There is just one problem. The one-time pad requires a key that is as long as the message, and that key must be secret. And that key must be shared between sender and receiver before any message is sent. Which means that if you want to send 1,000,000 characters of secret communication, you must first securely deliver 1,000,000 characters of random key. And if you can securely deliver 1,000,000 characters of random key, you could have just securely delivered the 1,000,000-character message in the same way. The one-time pad solves the problem of the ciphertext and preserves the problem of the key, intact, in amber, untouched. Shannon showed that perfect secrecy exists. He also showed, gently and with mathematical precision, that perfect secrecy is in some sense self-defeating. To be perfectly secure, your key must be at least as hard to distribute as your message. You have not solved the key problem. You have just made it a different key problem. This is the heartbreaking part, if you let it be. Everything falls. The pad is perfect, and the pad is impractical, and there is nothing else. Except there is that word again. Because while Shannon was proving the perfect ceiling and the practical flaw, while the world was filing away his paper and concluding that cryptography had found its limits, someone else was beginning to think about the key problem itself. Not around it, not past it, at it, directly, as if it were a puzzle rather than a fact of nature. His name was Whitfield Diffie, and in the early 1970s he became something close to obsessed. Diffie was not attached to a government agency or a military unit. He was, in the early part of his search, working independently, a young researcher, restless and unconventional, convinced that the question of key distribution had never been properly attacked because the people who needed to attack it most were the same people who needed to keep their methods secret. He thought about it the way you might think about a locked room you are not supposed to enter, pacing around it, looking at it from different angles, occasionally pressing an ear to the wall. He found a collaborator in Martin Hellman at Stanford University, and he found a third contributor in a graduate student named Ralph Merkle, who had been working on a related approach he called Merkle's puzzles. The ideas were in the air, crystallizing around the same question at the same time, the way important ideas sometimes do. In 1976, they published a paper. It was called New Directions in Cryptography. And it described something that, if you had never encountered it before, sounds like a trick, sounds like a sleight of hand, sounds like a beautiful lie. Here is what they proposed. Imagine two people, call them anything you like, who want to share a secret. They have never met. They have no courier. Every message they send passes through a channel where an eavesdropper can read everything. Absolutely everything. Every number, every letter. There is no hiding. Under every assumption of cryptography up to 1976, this situation is hopeless. There is no way for them to establish a shared secret, because any attempt to share the secret is itself a message that can be read. But here is the thing. What if there existed a mathematical operation that was easy to do in one direction and brutally hard to reverse? Not just difficult, not merely inconvenient, computationally infeasible, meaning that even with all the computers in the world working for longer than the age of the universe, you could not reverse it in any useful time. Does such an operation exist? It does. Several of them, in fact. But the one Diffie and Hellman used is modular exponentiation, which is a long phrase for something you can picture quite easily. Imagine a clock face, not a normal 12-hour clock, a very large clock with a prime number of positions on its face. You pick a number, you raise it to a power, and you read off where you land on that clock. That is it. That is the operation. Forward, effortless. A computer does it in a fraction of a second. Backward, you see where the hand is pointing, and you try to figure out what power put it there. And that problem, finding the exponent given only the result, is called the discrete logarithm problem, and it is, as far as anyone in mathematics has been able to determine in the 50 years since, extremely hard. Not just hard. Hard in a way that does not seem to get easier as computers get faster, because throwing more computing power at it does not help proportionally. So here is the key exchange, made slow enough to follow. Each person picks a secret number. They keep it. They do not share it. They share something else. They both agree, publicly, on a base number and a large prime number to use as the clock. This is not secret. The eavesdropper can see it. That is fine. Now each person takes their private secret number, performs the modular exponentiation with the shared public numbers, and sends the result across the channel. In the open. The eavesdropper can see this too. That is also fine. And now each person takes what the other sent and combines it with their own private secret number, using the same operation. And when they do, they arrive at the same number, the same secret number, without ever having sent it, without it ever having appeared on the channel. The eavesdropper, who saw every number that crossed the wire, cannot reconstruct it, because to do so they would need to reverse the one-way function, and that is the computation that cannot be done. Two people just shared a secret in full public view, shouting the pieces of it where everyone could hear, and still walking away with something that no one listening could reconstruct. Take a moment with that. There is no rush. If you were half asleep a moment ago, you might want to let that settle, because it is one of the genuinely surprising things that has happened in the last several centuries of mathematics. It feels like it should not work. It feels like cheating. It violates something intuitive. You cannot get something hidden from things that are visible, except that under the right mathematical conditions, you can. That was 1976, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. But there was still a piece missing. The key exchange solved the problem of agreeing on a shared secret over an open channel. What it did not immediately solve was the problem of asymmetry the problem of one person being able to send something that only a specific other person could read, without any prior exchange at all. What it did not give you was a way for a stranger, someone you had never communicated with, to send you something private. That came 1 year later, in 1977. At MIT, 3 mathematicians, Ron Rivest, Shamir, and Leonard Adleman, were sitting around thinking about the problem of one-way functions, and they found one that was so clean, so simple to state, that it almost seems too good to be true. Multiply 2 large prime numbers together. The result is very large. How large? Large enough that finding the 2 primes that produced it, that is, factoring the result, takes, on the best-known algorithms, an amount of computation that grows faster than any polynomial with the size of the number. For numbers large enough, it is for all practical purposes impossible. That asymmetry, multiplication is fast, factoring is slow, is the foundation. And on that foundation, they built a system called NSA, which stands for Rivest, Shamir, Adleman, and which is still, in various forms, one of the most widely used cryptographic systems in the world. Here is the padlock version, the version without equations. Imagine you have a padlock, a physical padlock, made of steel. You also have the only key that opens it. You put the open padlock in a box, and you mail the box to everyone. To the whole world, if you like. You publish it. Anyone who wants to send you something private just puts it in a container, snaps your padlock shut, and sends it to you. No one else can open that container, because no one else has the key. The padlock is your public key. Anyone can snap it shut. Anyone can lock something for you. Only you can open it. That is NSA. Your public key is the large number, the product of your 2 secret primes. Anyone can use it to lock a message for you. Only you know the 2 primes, your private key, and only knowing both of them lets you unlock it. For the first time in the history of cryptography, 2 people who had never met, who shared no secret, who had never exchanged anything, could communicate privately. No courier. No meeting in advance. No key to carry across a border. No vulnerable human in the chain. The 4,000-year problem. Dissolved, not by making the message harder to read, not by a cleverer scrambling, by rethinking what the problem actually was, and then solving the right problem. Rivest, Shamir, and Adleman, published in 1977. There was a celebration, quiet in the way mathematics celebrations tend to be. But there is a postscript to this story, a gentle and slightly melancholy one, because the story of who got there first is not quite the story that was told at the time. Across the Atlantic, inside Britain's government communications headquarters, the Signals Intelligence Agency, successor in spirit to Room 40 and to Bletchley Park, a mathematician named James Ellis had conceived of the general idea of what he called non-secret encryption. He arrived at the concept somewhere around 1969 and 1970. The core insight that it might be possible to create an encryption system where the enciphering key and the deciphering key were different, and the enciphering key could be public. A young mathematician at GCQ named Clifford Cox was asked in 1973 if he could make the idea concrete. He sat down with the problem and solved it in about half an hour. What he found was, essentially, RESA, the same mathematics, the same prime factoring foundation, the same public-private key structure. And a third person, Malcolm Williamson, independently worked out the equivalent of the Diffie-Hellman exchange. All of this happened years before the American publications. All of it was classified. None of it was shared with the academic world. The people at GSQ who found it could not tell anyone what they had done, because secret agencies keep secrets even about their own ideas, especially about their own ideas, and so the three of them carried the knowledge quietly for decades. It was only in 1997 that it was revealed. By then, Diffie, Hellman, Merkle, Rivest, Shamir and Adleman had published their work, built a world on it, and received the credit that in another timeline might have been shared differently. Ellis died in November 1997, 1 month after the declassification. He spent most of his career unable to tell anyone that he had done the thing he had done. There is something to sit with in that. Not anger, just the particular quietness of it. The full shape of a discovery, hidden so long, it almost became invisible. Now, the mathematics was out. Public key cryptography was published, understood, and slowly beginning to spread. Through the 1980s, it began to work its way from research papers into actual systems, and as it spread, it ran directly into something. The world's governments had spent decades controlling cryptography. Encryption was classified in the United States as a munition under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. ITAR, exporting strong encryption without a license was, legally, the same as exporting a weapon. The mathematics was fine to publish. The working software was something else. This became the crypto wars. In 1991, a man named Phil Zimmermann released a piece of software called PGP. Pretty good privacy. It was free. It used RISA and other strong methods. It was designed to let ordinary people send private messages that governments and agencies could not read. And it spread. It spread beyond the United States onto bulletin board systems and across early networks. And when it crossed a border, it became, in the eyes of US law, an export of a munition. The government opened a criminal investigation into Phil Zimmermann. For 3 years he faced the possibility of prosecution, of prison, for writing a program that let people keep their messages private. He and his supporters found a response that is, depending on your mood, funny or elegant, or both. Encryption software was a munition. But a book was speech. The First Amendment protected speech from government restriction, and so the entire source code of PGP was printed. In a physical book. A hardback. And the book was legally exported. Because you could not use ITAR to stop a book. Somewhere in there is a joke about the letter being mightier than the cipher, and I will leave you to find it. The investigation was dropped in 1996 without charges. But the episode marked something, the moment when ordinary citizens began to understand that cryptography was not just an abstraction, not just a wartime thing, not just the property of governments. It was infrastructure. It was the plumbing of the private self. Around the same time, the US government was trying another approach. In 1993, the National Security Agency promoted a chip, the Clipper chip. It was hardware encryption, built into phones and devices. It was strong encryption, genuinely strong. But it had what its designers called key escrow. Every Clipper encrypted communication was also encrypted with a government key held in 2 separate escrow databases, so that law enforcement with a warrant could access the content. The idea was that ordinary citizens would have strong encryption for ordinary purposes, and the government would have a back door, accessible only under judicial oversight, for national security and law enforcement purposes. A computer scientist named Matt Blaze looked at the Clipper protocol carefully and in 1994 published a paper demonstrating a flaw. The protocol could be exploited to use the Clipper system's strong encryption while effectively bypassing the key escrow mechanism. The back door had a gap. The thing designed to give the government access could be used in a way that denied it. The Clipper chip effectively died in the mid-1990s. It never became the standard its proponents had hoped, and the episode left a mark on the broader conversation about encryption and government access that has not entirely healed, because the question it raised, can you have strong encryption for everyone with a guaranteed emergency access for authority, has not found an answer that satisfies everyone, and may not have one. Meanwhile, the mathematics kept moving. In 1985, two mathematicians, Neal Koblitz and Victor Miller, independently proposed something called elliptic-curve cryptography. They proposed it separately, in the same year, without each other's knowledge, which is the kind of thing that happens in mathematics when an idea is ready to exist. The mathematics behind elliptic curves is too beautiful and too involved to unspool completely in a sleep narration, and you are probably not in the right posture for it right now, and that is fine. The important thing to know is this: elliptic curves provide the same kind of one-way function that RISA relies on, the same idea of an operation that is easy in one direction and hard to reverse, but with a different, more efficient mathematical structure. This means that you can achieve the same level of security as URSA, but with much smaller keys. Keys that are shorter, faster to process, easier to handle. Which is why, if you are listening to this on a smartphone, the cryptography protecting most of your connections right now is almost certainly elliptic curve cryptography. Your messages, your connections to websites, your banking app. Elliptic curves are the reason all of that happens quickly enough that you never think about it. So by the 1990s, the world had this. Public key cryptography in practical, efficient forms, deployed broadly, protecting the growing digital life of ordinary people. The key distribution problem, the one that had seemed permanent, was not permanent. It was solved. And yet, in 1994, a mathematician named Peter Shor published an algorithm. He was not working at a signals intelligence agency. He was not working on cryptography directly. He was working in quantum computing, a field that in 1994 was still largely theoretical. The study of computers that use quantum mechanical phenomena to perform calculations, computers that did not yet exist at any scale that mattered. And Shor showed that a sufficiently large quantum computer, running what is now called Shor's algorithm, could factor large numbers efficiently. Not the way classical computers factor them, the slow, grind-it-out way that makes RESA safe. Quickly. Polynomially quickly, which in the language of computational complexity means as the numbers get larger, the time to factor them grows manageably, not astronomically. A quantum computer running Shor's algorithm would cut through ESA and elliptic curve cryptography the way Al-Kindi's frequency analysis cut through the simple substitution cipher. Cleanly, completely, the mathematics of public key cryptography, the asymmetry between easy multiplication and hard factoring, the one-way function on which everything rests, is precisely the thing that a quantum computer threatens. Not classical cryptography. Not the one-time pad, which is still perfect and still impractical. Public key cryptography. The thing that solved the 4,000-year problem. Now, to be precise about this, because precision matters, in 1994, and at the moment you are listening to this, a quantum computer large enough and reliable enough to run Shor's algorithm at the required scale does not exist. The algorithm is proven. The mathematics is solid. The quantum computers that exist are real but small and noisy, and the gap between them and the scale needed to threaten RESA is substantial. But the field moves, and the threat is real enough that governments and standards bodies began, years ago, preparing for it. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, ran a process that began in 2016, inviting researchers from around the world to submit candidate algorithms for what is called post-quantum cryptography. Schemes designed to resist not just classical computers, but quantum computers. The leading approaches are built on something called lattice-based cryptography, mathematical structures in high-dimensional space where certain problems are believed to be hard even for quantum machines. Believed, not proven. The same honest uncertainty that every cryptographer carries. In 2022, NIST announced its first selections. In 2024, one of them was formally standardized as FIPS 203, also known as ML-Chem, based on an algorithm called CRYSTALS-Kyber for key exchange. Other selected algorithms, crystals dilithium and Sphinx Plus, address the related problem of digital signatures, the way you prove to a system that you are who you say you are. The migration is underway. Slowly, as these migrations always go, there is an enormous amount of existing infrastructure to update, an enormous number of systems and devices and protocols that rely on the current mathematics, and changing them takes time and coordination on a scale that is almost impossible to visualize. But it is happening. The two races are running simultaneously. The race to build quantum computers capable of breaking what currently exists, and the race to replace what currently exists with something quantum-resistant before that happens. Nobody knows, tonight, which race will finish first, and in that uncertainty is something very old, something that goes all the way back to the citale wound around its rod, to Julius Caesar shifting his letters by 3, to all Kindi counting symbols in a Baghdad that was the center of the world's knowledge. Every cipher in this story that was once called unbreakable was eventually broken. Every system that seemed permanent eventually dissolved. The history of cryptography is a history of confidence being slowly, carefully, mathematically deflated, and then rebuilt in a different shape. What is permanent, it turns out, is not any particular cipher. What is permanent is the question, and you are inside that question, right now, wherever you are. The lamp on the nightstand, or the dark of the room, or the soft glow of a screen you are trying to let go of. You exist at the exact moment when a 4,000-year problem was solved, and a new one, related and different, is being worked on by thousands of mathematicians and engineers in universities and government labs and small companies in countries you have and have not heard of. Every private message you sent today, every time your bank confirmed your identity, every time a website showed you that small padlock icon in the address bar, that little sign that says, "This conversation is between you and us and no one else." All of that rests on the mathematics of Rivest and Shamir and Adleman at MIT in 1977. On the one-way function that Diffie and Hellman described in 1976. On the insight that some things are easy in one direction and brutally hard to reverse. You could not have described the trick this morning, perhaps, but the trick was there, underneath everything, like a foundation you walk on without knowing what it is made of. Now you know a little of what it is made of. And I think that is a good thing to carry. We have come so far tonight, from a leather ribbon wound around a Spartan rod, passed to a general who would have held it up to the light and seen only a jumble, until he found the right rod and wound it, and the words appeared. From Julius Caesar shifting his letters by 3, trusting that his enemies did not know the rule. From al-Kindi in 9th century Baghdad, holding up a parchment covered in symbols and counting, and understanding that language has a shape you cannot hide. From Belasso's polyalphabetic cipher, misnamed and misattributed and called unbreakable for 3 centuries, until Babbage's quiet mind found the key length hiding in the repetitions. From Thomas Phelippes, sitting in the half-dark, decrypting the letters of a queen who did not know her code was already open, forging a postscript in her own cipher to draw out the names of the conspirators. From the yellow paper of the Zimmermann telegram passed between desks in the Admiralty, decoded by Nigel de Grey in room 40, its words about Texas and New Mexico and Arizona eventually reaching the American public and tipping a nation toward a war. From the Enigma machine, its rotors, its plugboard, its elegant and fatal flaw, the letter that could never encipher to itself. And from the 3 Polish mathematicians, Rejewski and Ricci and Zygalski, who broke it first, who used the theory of permutations and groups to reconstruct the wiring of a machine they had never seen, and who handed that knowledge in a forest meeting, 5 weeks before the tanks rolled. From Alan Turing's bomb cycling through settings, from Gordon Welchman's diagonal board multiplying its reach, from the cribs, the predictable words in predictable places, the weather reports, the formulaic sign-offs that gave the codebreakers their footholds. From Bill Toot reconstructing the Lorenz cipher in his mind without ever seeing it, and Tommy Flowers building Colossus to attack it. From the Navajo code talkers transmitting messages in a language that no codebook could capture, fast and unbroken across the Pacific. From Claude Shannon in his Bell Labs office proving with clean mathematics that perfect secrecy exists and is a padlock that requires a key as large as everything you want to lock. From Gilbert Vernam's patent and Joseph Moborgan's insistence and Frank Miller's 1882 codebook, the lineage of a system that is still perfect and still impractical a half-century after it was proven. From Whitfield Diffie pacing around the key distribution problem and Martin Hellman at Stanford and Ralph Merkle's puzzles, all of them converging on the same insight that you could hide a secret in an operation that could not be reversed. From the paper they published in 1976, New Directions in Cryptography, which is one of the driest titles ever given to something that changed the world. From Rivest and Shamir and Adleman working at MIT, from 2 large prime numbers multiplied together. From a padlock that anyone can snap shut and only one person can open, from James Ellis conceiving non-secret encryption in the rooms of GCQ, from Clifford Cox solving it in half an hour in 1973, from Malcolm Williamson arriving at the Diffie-Hellman equivalent, all of them carrying the knowledge quietly, secretly, for years, until 1997, when it could finally be said aloud. From Phil Zimmermann putting strong encryption in the hands of anyone who wanted it, from the source code printed in a hardback book, from a federal investigation dropped without charges, from the Clipper chip and Matt Blaze's 1994 flaw, from Neal Koblitz and Victor Miller in 1985, independently, the same year, the same beautiful structure, elliptic curves, smaller keys, the same security. From Peter Shor in 1994, the algorithm that does not yet have the machine to run it, and from NIST's long process of choosing its successors, from CRYSTALS-Kyber and ML-Chem, and crystals-dilithium and Sphinx Plus, from the lattices in high-dimensional space that are believed, not proven, believed to hold against whatever comes next. From the citale to the lattice, 4,000 years and one unbroken thread. The thread is not the ciphers. The thread is the question. How do you keep something private in a world that wants to see everything? And the answer that took 4,000 years to arrive was not, make the message harder to read. The answer was, stop thinking about the message. Think about the key. Think about whether a key is even necessary, whether two strangers can arrive at a shared secret without one. And the answer to that turned out to be yes. Under the right mathematics. Yes, you are listening in some corner of the night that is yours. Your phone, your tablet, your computer, somewhere nearby, is right now, even as you breathe slowly towards sleep, doing that mathematics, making that exchange. Turning the trick that Diffie and Hellman described, and that Cox had found 3 years earlier in a classified room, and that Rivest and Shamir and Adleman formalized, and that the world built its private life upon. All of that history, all of those rooms and machines and parchment strips and telegraph wires and frequency counts and perforated Zygalski sheets, all of it ended up here, in the device on your nightstand, in the invisible layer beneath the surface of every ordinary private thing. You do not have to hold all of it. You do not have to remember the names or the dates or the exact mechanism. If you drift off into sleep now and wake up tomorrow remembering only that two strangers can share a secret in a room where everyone is listening, and that this is the trick underneath everything you trust, that is quite enough. That is, honestly, more than most people ever know about it. And I find that beautiful, a little. The scale of what is quietly present in ordinary life. The depth beneath the surface. A message wound around a rod 2,500 years ago, and your banking app. The same story, the same question, the same impulse. This is mine. I want it to stay mine. I want to send it to you and no one else, traced across every century between then and now. If you are still here with me, and it is all right if you are not, it is all right if you drifted somewhere comfortable an hour ago, wherever you are in this night, I hope you found something in it. Something to take into sleep. The comfortable strangeness of how much thought has gone into keeping things private. How much mathematics lives underneath the ordinary. How the permanent seeming problems have a way, sometimes, of dissolving when someone finally asks the right question. The night is yours now. The ideas are not going anywhere. They will be here when you wake up, patient as mathematics, quiet as a padlock, waiting to be opened by the one person who holds the key. If you enjoyed this slow journey, a like and a subscribe mean more than you might think to a small channel like this one. Small creators like me genuinely rely on your support to keep making these. And if you feel like leaving a word, just a word, wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is in your corner of the night, I would love to know. It is one of the small, private joys of doing this. Sleep well, fellow voyager. The next journey keeps until you wake.